both hands moving in coordinated opposition. Left hand holds tension on the yarn, right hand loops the needle through, left hand releases a measured length, right hand pulls the new stitch tight. 1 to 3 cycles per second. Every cycle requires your cerebellum to synchronize bilateral timing across both hemispheres, calibrate force in each hand independently, and compute spatial positioning of a needle tip meeting yarn at a precise location determined by the opposite hand's grip. The computation runs continuously. It runs bilaterally. And it runs at a processing cost that your brain cannot afford to pay while simultaneously sustaining the neural activity that produces worry. Your prefrontal cortex, the region that generates rumination, replays yesterday's disagreement, rehearses tomorrow's difficult conversation, and maintains the low-grade anxious noise you experience as overthinking. Loses the competition for cortical resources the moment your hands begin the rhythm. The rumination does not fade because you decided to stop worrying. It stops because your cerebellum commandeered the bandwidth the worry was using. The needles displace the noise. The displacement is mechanical. It operates through resource competition in the cortex. Two demanding processes competing for finite processing capacity, and the motor demand winning because the hands are moving and the worry is not anchored to anything the motor system needs. You have felt this. You have picked up the needles after a difficult day and noticed, not immediately, not in the first minute, but somewhere around the 10th or 15th minute, that the noise in your head has gone quiet. The argument you were rehearsing is no longer looping. The anxiety about tomorrow has receded. The mental channel that was broadcasting worry is now occupied by something else. The rhythm of the hands, the count of the stitches, the tension in the yarn, the growing weight of the fabric. You attributed this to distraction, to keeping your hands busy, to the soothing quality of repetition. Every explanation you offered was psychological. The mechanism is neurological, and the neurological explanation is more interesting than the psychological one, because it reveals that your knitting needles are doing something to your brain that no passive activity can replicate. Here is what your brain does when your hands are idle. Because the neural network that produces rumination is not a malfunction. It is a default setting that activates whenever nothing else is demanding cortical resources. The default mode network. The self-referential processing system that activates whenever your cortex has nothing else to do, turns on when your hands are still. When you sit in a chair, watch television, lie in bed waiting for sleep, wait in a physician's office, you know this network. You know it as the voice that starts talking the moment you sit down with nothing to do. You know it as the 3 a.m. loop that replays a decision you made 20 years ago and asks whether you should have chosen differently. You know it as the mental rehearsal of a conversation you need to have next week. Running through it once, then twice, then 14 times, each version slightly different, none of them reducing the anxiety about the actual conversation. You know it as a network that constructs tomorrow's physician appointment in advance, imagining the questions, rehearsing the answers, catastrophizing the results before a single word has been exchanged. The default mode network is not thinking. It is looping, running self-referential processing on material it has already processed, generating anxiety about outcomes it cannot influence, consuming metabolic resources without producing actionable insight. An hour of it produces useful reflection. 6 hours of unchecked default mode activity. The television watched passively, the evening spent sitting, the night spent lying awake, produces the grinding, circular, unproductive rumination that erodes well-being without generating a single insight. The first hour did not already produce. Think about what suppresses it, because the only reliable method for reducing default mode activity is engaging alternative neural networks that compete for the cortical resources the default mode requires. Meditation suppresses it through the frontal parietal attention network, sustained, focused attention drawing resources away from self-referential processing. Physical exercise suppresses it through the motor network, the demands of coordinated movement consuming resources the default mode would otherwise claim. Rhythmic handwork suppresses it through both simultaneously. Motor cortex engagement plus sustained bilateral cerebellar demand, drawing resources away from the default mode network through 2 channels at once for as long as the hands are working. And the cerebellar demand is where the mechanism earns its claim, because the cerebellum's role in bilateral handwork is computationally extraordinary, and the computational cost is what displaces the rumination. Your cerebellum sits at the base of your brain. It contains more than half of all the neurons in your entire brain, despite comprising roughly 10% of brain volume, a density that reflects its computational function. The cerebellum performs a real-time computation that transforms motor intention into motor execution. When your premotor cortex sends a command, move the right hand to loop the needle through the stitch, the cerebellum receives a copy of that command, compares it with the proprioceptive feedback arriving from the hand in real time. Where the hand is, how fast it is moving, what resistance it is encountering, computes the error between where the hand is and where it should be, and sends a corrective signal back to the motor cortex before the movement is complete. The correction happens within the movement. The error computation runs continuously. Every stitch is a cerebellar computation, and the computation is invisible to you because the cerebellum operates below conscious awareness. During bilateral rhythmic handwork, this computation doubles, because both hands are executing independent motor programs that must be temporally coupled. Your left hand holds tension. Your right hand loops. The timing must synchronize. The right hand cannot pull until the left hand has positioned the yarn at the correct tension and angle. The force must coordinate. Too much tension from the left and the right cannot pass the needle through. Too little, and the stitch collapses loose on the needle. The spatial positioning must align. The needle tip must meet the yarn at a location determined by the left hand's grip, a location that changes with every stitch as the fabric grows, the row lengthens, and the working geometry shifts. Consider what happens when you reach the end of a row and turn the work. The entire spatial relationship between your hands reverses. What was the leading hand becomes the following hand. What was pushing becomes pulling. The spatial map your cerebellum was using for the previous 40 stitches must reconfigure for the return row. New angles, new grip positions, new force vectors. Your cerebellum recalculates within 2 or 3 stitches. You do not notice the recalculation. The transition feels automatic. It is automatic, automatically computed by the most neuron-dense structure in your brain operating at full bilateral capacity. Cerebellum is performing bilateral error correction on 2 independent motor programs coupled by timing, force, and spatial constraints, updating at 1 to 3 Hz across both hemispheres simultaneously. The cortical resources this demands are drawn from the general pool available to all neural networks, including the default mode network. The default mode loses access to the bandwidth it needs to sustain the rumination loop. The worry does not quiet because you chose to stop worrying. It quiets because the cerebellum is consuming the computational resources the worry required, and the cerebellum's demand is continuous, bilateral, and non-negotiable for as long as your hands are moving. Now, a second question. Because cortical competition explains why the rumination stops during handwork, it does not explain why you feel calm afterward, why the settling persists after you put the needles down, why the evening feels different from an evening without handwork, why the effect seems to linger in a way that distraction alone does not produce. If the mechanism were purely competitive, the cerebellum consuming bandwidth that the default mode needs, then the rumination should resume the moment you stop knitting. For many people, it does not resume immediately. Something has changed in the interim. The brain state you return to after an hour of handwork is measurably different from the brain state you were in before you picked up the needles. The competition explanation accounts for suppression during handwork. It does not account for the residual calm. 3 mechanisms do. Bilateral rhythmic stimulation, alternating motor output to the left and right sides of the body at a steady rhythm. Increases serotonin availability through a pathway that is clinically well established but not fully mapped at the molecular level. EMDR, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing. Uses bilateral eye movements, bilateral tapping, or bilateral auditory tones at approximately 1 Hz to reduce the emotional intensity of traumatic memories. The mechanism is believed to involve interhemispheric processing. The alternating bilateral input forces communication between the left and right hemispheres through the corpus callosum, engaging bilateral prefrontal processing that modulates amygdala reactivity. Knitting produces bilateral rhythmic motor output at 1 to 3 Hz, the frequency range EMDR operates in. Your hands alternate in a rhythmic pattern. Your motor cortex alternates activation between left and right hemispheres with every stitch cycle. The interhemispheric communication that EMDR harnesses for trauma processing occurs naturally during any sustained bilateral rhythmic handwork, every knitting session, every crochet row, every hour of beadwork threading left-right through the pattern. The precise mechanism, how alternating bilateral motor output modulates serotonergic tone, has not been fully characterized at the molecular level. The clinical correlation is consistent. Bilateral rhythmic activity produces measurable serotonergic effects across the literature. The serotonergic pathway is inferred from the EMDR literature. Bilateral rhythmic stimulation at comparable frequencies producing measurable serotonergic effects in clinical populations producing measurable serotonergic effects in clinical populations. Whether knitting specifically produces equivalent serotonergic changes has not been directly measured. The calm that remains after you put the needles down is predicted to be partly serotonergic, a neurochemical residue of the bilateral motor rhythm your hands maintain for the last hour. Riley's cortisol and heart rate data is consistent with the prediction. The physiological markers of serotonergic activation are present even if the serotonergic the residue is real. The calm is not imagined. The brain state you occupy after an hour of knitting is measurably different from the brain state you occupied before you began. Riley's data confirms the difference. The serotonergic explanation is the most physiologically coherent account of why. Riley and colleagues measured cortisol and heart rate in subjects performing knitting versus reading. Knitting reduced heart rate and cortisol significantly, effects comparable to structured relaxation training protocols. The reduction was specific to the rhythmic bilateral motor activity. Passive hand rest did not produce equivalent effects. Reading, a focused cognitive activity that engages the frontoparietal network. Suppressed default mode activity, but did not produce the cortisol and heart rate changes that bilateral motor rhythm produced. The bilateral motor component adds something that cognitive engagement alone does not provide. You see, and this is where the cascade reveals itself. Because the hands do not just suppress the default mode and produce serotonin. The hands set your breathing, and the breathing sets your heart, and the heart sets your vagal tone. 4 systems entrained by one motor rhythm, and the cascade is the reason the evening feels different after knitting than after television. The reason is not psychological, it is architectural. 4 systems, 1 rhythm, the rhythm governing all 4. During sustained rhythmic handwork, motor-respiratory coupling predicts that your respiratory rhythm entrains to the motor rhythm, your breathing rate synchronizing with the stitch cycle at a subharmonic frequency. The anatomy is established. The premotor regions that generate the hand movement rhythm also project to the respiratory pattern generators in the brainstem. The specific entrainment of breathing to knitting rhythm has not been formally measured. The prediction follows from the anatomy, and the observation is consistent with it. When your hands move at a steady 1 to 3 Hz, your respiratory system settles at a rate that is a subharmonic of the motor frequency, typically 12 to 18 breaths per minute, the range associated with balanced autonomic tone and optimal heart rate variability. Breathing you settle into during knitting, slow, regular, effortless, is not consciously chosen. You did not decide to breathe at 14 breaths per minute. Your hands decided. The motor rhythm entrained the respiratory pattern generator, and the respiratory pattern generator set the breathing rate without consulting your cortex. Next time you are knitting steadily, notice your breathing without changing it. It will be slower than your resting rate. More regular, more rhythmic, more rhythmic. The hands impose that pattern on the lungs through a brainstem coupling you were never aware of. The breathing rate, in turn, drives the vagal baroflex. The breathing pattern your hands impose matches the slow, regular, exhale, dominant rhythm. The side discussion described as the body's most efficient parasympathetic trigger. Regular breathing at 12 to 18 breaths per minute produces steady parasympathetic input through the vagal pathway. The hands set the breathing parasympathetic input through the vagal pathway. The breathing sets the vagal tone. The vagal tone sets the heart rate variability, one motor rhythm cascading through three downstream systems, motor to respiratory to cardiovascular, producing an integrated state of physiological calm that you attribute to the relaxation of knitting, but that is a multi-system entrainment cascade initiated by the bilateral rhythm of your hands and propagated through brainstem circuits that do not require your awareness or your cooperation. And the cascade has a fourth layer, because sustained rhythmic motor activity induces a specific brain oscillation that meditation practitioners spend years training to achieve. Sustained rhythmic handwork produces increased frontal theta activity, 4 to 8 Hz oscillation in the frontal cortex, the brainwave pattern associated with meditation, flow states, and creative insight. The mechanism is motor entrainment. The repetitive motor rhythm at 1 to 3 Hz generates an oscillatory signal in the motor cortex that propagates to connected frontal regions, biasing their oscillatory frequency toward the theta range. Frontal theta dominance is the neurophysiological signature of the flow state, the subjective experience of absorbed attention, effortless focus, loss of time awareness, and reduced self-consciousness. You have experienced this. You looked up from the needles, and 2 hours had passed. You did not notice the time. You did not notice the discomfort in your back until you stopped. You were not asleep, and you were not concentrating in the effortful way that solving a problem requires. You were in a state that felt like being awake and dreaming simultaneously, present in the room but absent from the mental noise that usually fills your awareness. Present in the hands but absent from the self. The stitches were forming, and you were watching them form without the sense that you were the one forming them. The hands working autonomously, the yarn moving, the fabric growing, and you observing from somewhere quiet that the rest of your day does not provide access to. That state is frontal theta dominance, predicted by the motor entrainment literature, measured during meditation and rhythmic motor tasks, inferred during knitting from the motor rhythm's frequency and the frontal cortex's known response to sustained rhythmic input. The specific measurement, theta power, during knitting compared to a non-rhythmic control has not been published. The prediction follows from established motor entrainment principles. Repetitive motor output at 1 to 3 Hz produces oscillatory propagation to connected frontal regions. The flow state you experienced, absorbed, effortless, time-dissolved, is the phenomenological signature of theta dominance. And the fact that a motor rhythm may produce the brain state that meditation traditions spend decades training to achieve through sustained attention is the finding that ended the distinction between craft and contemplative practice for me. Well, and what the hands report back matters as much as what the hands do. Because knitting provides continuous proprioceptive feedback that occupies the largest cortical territory available for any body region, and the feedback is rich in a way that most motor activities cannot match. Your hands contain the highest density of mechanoreceptors of any body surface. The fingertips alone contain approximately 2,500 receptors per square centimeter. During knitting, these receptors report continuously, the stretch of yarn between the fingers as tension builds and releases with each stitch, the resistance of the needle passing through the loop, metal against fiber, the slight catch, and then the slide, the texture of the yarn changing as it compresses and then releases. The weight of the growing fabric pulling on the working yarn increases imperceptibly with each row. After 30 rows, the pull is measurably different from row 1, and your hands have adjusted their grip and their tension unconsciously to compensate. The texture of the fiber sliding across the skin registers differently depending on the material. Wool catches on dry skin, cotton slides, silk barely registers. Your fingertips know what fiber you're working with before your eyes confirm it. This feedback travels through the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway to the somatosensory cortex, occupying the hand region of the cortical homunculus, the cortical representation of the hand that is disproportionately large relative to the hand's physical size because the hand's sensory importance to the organism is disproportionately high. The hand region of the homunculus is larger than the cortical representation of your entire torso. When knitting activates this territory with rich, varying, continuous input, the cortical occupation is substantial. A significant fraction of your somatosensory processing capacity is consumed by what the fingers are reporting. Combination of motor output through the cerebellum and premotor cortex and sensory input through the somatosensory cortex from a single body region creates a tightly coupled motor sensory loop. Your hands are simultaneously doing and feeling, sending and receiving, acting and reporting. The loop is computationally demanding and sensorially rich. It leaves minimal cortical bandwidth for the default mode network. Television provides visual input through one channel. Music provides auditory input through one channel. Knitting provides motor output through the cerebellar premotor loop and sensory input through the somatosensory loop simultaneously. Dual-channel cortical occupation that single-channel activities cannot match. The default mode network competes against two channels of cortical demand rather than one. It loses more completely. The rumination suppression is deeper. And then the social dimension suppression is deeper. And then the social dimension. Because throughout recorded history, handwork has been a group activity, and the combination of individual neurological benefit with social connection produces a compound intervention that deserves separate attention. Knitting circles, quilting bees, sewing groups, crochet meetups. The tradition of handwork in company is ancient and cross-cultural. The format survived because it works on two levels simultaneously. If you knit alone, you receive the motor cortical suppression, the serotonergic bilateral activation, the respiratory entrainment, the frontal theta flow state, the proprioceptive cortical occupation. If you knit in a group, you receive all of these, plus the social neurochemistry of co-regulation, oxytocin from sustained social contact, cortisol reduction from the presence of trusted companions, vagal co-regulation through eye contact and conversation. The two mechanisms are additive. The motor benefit operates whether you knit alone or in company. The social benefit operates whether the group activity is knitting or conversation over tea. But the combination has a quality that neither component produces alone. The motor rhythm calms the nervous system from the bottom up, cerebellum to brainstem, to respiratory, to cardiovascular. The social connection calms the nervous system from the outside in, through the vagal social engagement system that responds to faces, voices, and the presence of safe others. The two pathways converge on the parasympathetic nervous system from different directions. The convergence produces a depth of settling that knitting alone or socializing alone does not reach. For you, if you are over 65 and the evenings are quiet, if the default mode network runs unchecked for hours between dinner and sleep, if the evenings are more isolated than they used to be, the knitting group is worth finding. The needles provide the motor benefit. The company provides the social benefit. The combination addresses the neurological dimension of rumination and the social dimension of isolation through a single weekly commitment. The scarf is a byproduct. The intervention is the hour. Specific craft does not matter. Knitting, crocheting, sewing, beadwork, whittling, weaving, macrame, loom work, embroidery. Any activity that requires both hands to move in coordinated rhythmic opposition activates the bilateral cerebellar coordination, the motor respiratory entrainment, the frontal theta induction, and the dual-channel cortical occupation that displaces the default mode network. The mechanism is in the motor pattern. The product is incidental. The scarf, the blanket, the beaded bracelet, the whittled spoon, each is a physical record of a neurological intervention. The hands performed while the conscious mind was elsewhere. 20 minutes is sufficient for frontal theta entrainment to establish and for the respiratory cardiovascular cascade to settle into its entrained rhythm. Here is what the physiology predicts across a session, assembled from the onset times of each individual mechanism, measured in its own literature rather than timed as an integrated sequence during knitting specifically. The individual components predict the following progression. In the first 5 minutes, the default mode network is still competing. The worry is still present, fading but present, the rumination loop running alongside the motor program, the cortical resources split between the two demands. Your hands are finding their rhythm. The cerebellum is calibrating to the specific tension, gauge, and spatial geometry of the current project. The cortical competition has begun, but the motor demand has not yet displaced the default mode entirely. By minute 10 to 15, the displacement is complete. The cerebellar computation has consumed enough bandwidth to starve the default mode of the resources it needs. The rumination loop has gone quiet, not suppressed by willpower, but abandoned by cortical allocation. The respiratory entrainment is establishing, your breathing rate has begun synchronizing with the motor rhythm, slowing toward the 12 to 18 range without your awareness. You may notice that the mental noise has stopped. More likely you will not notice, because the absence of noise is not an event, it is a subtraction. The worry was there, and then it was not there, and you did not mark the transition. By minute 20 to 30, the frontal theta oscillation has established. The flow state is arriving, the sense of absorbed attention, the softening of time awareness, the quality of being present in the hands without being present in the self-referential processing, the default mode usually maintains. The respiratory cardiovascular cascade is settled. Breathing rhythmic, heart rate variability elevated, vagal tone shifted toward parasympathetic bias. The serotonergic effect of bilateral interhemispheric activation is accumulating. By minute 40 to 60, the state is deep. The flow is sustained. The breathing is automatic and rhythmic. The default mode network is fully suppressed. The hands are working without conscious direction. The cerebellum executing the motor program. The somatosensory cortex processing the continuous proprioceptive feedback, the premotor cortex generating the bilateral rhythm, and the frontal cortex oscillating in theta, rather than producing the beta-dominant activity that characterizes anxious rumination. If you look up from knitting after an hour and feel that the evening has been qualitatively different from an evening spent watching television, you have correctly identified a neurological difference. The brain state that 1 hour of bilateral rhythmic handwork produces is measurably and experientially distinct from the brain state that 1 hour of passive visual input produces. Longer deepens the state, the flow strengthens with duration, the default mode suppression persists longer after cessation with longer sessions. If you knit for an hour in the evening, you're running a 60-minute bilateral cerebellar coordination program that suppresses the rumination network, entrains your respiratory and cardiac rhythms, sustains frontal theta oscillation, and occupies both motor and somatosensory cortex through a dual-channel loop that leaves the default mode network without the resources it requires to generate the worry you carried into the chair. And note if your hands are not what they were, because arthritis, reduced grip strength, and limited range of motion do not disqualify you from the mechanism. The bilateral cerebellar coordination demand scales with the complexity and speed of the movement. Slower stitching at reduced range of motion still requires bilateral timing, force calibration, and spatial positioning. The computation is less intense, but it is still bilateral, still continuous, still competing with the default mode for cortical resources. Larger needles reduce the grip demand. Thicker yarn reduces the fine motor precision required. Shorter sessions with rest intervals protect the joints while still providing the bilateral motor input the cascade requires. The mechanism does not require expert-level handwork at full speed. It requires two hands moving in coordinated rhythmic opposition, and the coordination operates at whatever speed and range of motion your hands can provide. Pick up the needles. The brain cannot hold the loop and the worry simultaneously. The loop wins. It always wins.